Okay, welcome back everybody to part 2 of the compression tutorial. This one is the different plugin applications. So I have a few different plugins here. There's 8. I'm also going to show you probably 2 more, so a total of 10 different plugins. I'll show you why they're useful in their different applications and go through some of the different parameters and just kind of why those different parameters are useful as well. I will start here with a demonstration of sidechain compression, because that's something that's used very often, especially in electronic music. So I'll go through a basic visual demonstration as well as a little bit of theory, not too much. And again, I might make a different, like a whole tutorial just on sidechain compression. So I'm not going to go too deep in this. I just want to demonstrate its usefulness and its application. So yeah, here we have no compression. So right now I have the compression on the bass, and the kick is being sent to the compressor, and that is what's going to activate the compression on the bass. So right now it's bypassed, so we don't have any compression. I'll take a snapshot of this too. Okay, and now with compression, you'll definitely hear the difference. So, visually, I'm sure you heard the difference. When the kick comes in, you could hear the bass go much quieter. It dips down. And visually here, you can see that this is like a nice full bass here, and this is the sidechained one, where like this is the same line right here, but when the kick comes in, it drops the volume all the way down to here, which is very noticeable, and then it slowly releases as per the settings that I chose. So yeah, this is very very harsh, so that you can really hear what it's actually doing. So yeah, what I have it is a very low threshold, a very fast attack, and a quite fast release at a very high ratio. So that's why it's giving it such a pronounced amount of compression, or a very pronounced amount of ducking, as they call it. Sidechain compression, same yada yada. So that I was using the C1 compressor from Waves. I used to do it with Cubase's stock compressor, because it has the built-in sidechain button right here. But I just recently bought the C1, and that also has the little button, and I'd rather use the Waves C1 because it's a little bit better quality. I don't want to say it's more transparent or anything like that, because I can't really tell the difference as far as that goes, but as far as quality and having no noticeable clicks or weird stuff going on, the Waves is definitely the way to go. So that's what I use now. Now I'll run through the rest of these stuff here. I already went through the Deesser, like why you would use it and sort of how you use it. You shape the frequency range that you want to activate the compressor, then you set a threshold. So you can get, there's quite a few different ones. Even like Cubase has its own Deesser. Waves has its Deesser. On the Cubase one here, you can just set a reduction amount. You can have an auto threshold even, or just set your threshold to whatever. And what's weird with this one is you can't set the frequency range, but it's already has its own built-in range. So if you just want to go very simple, just put something on that'll work in those typical frequency ranges, then sure, just put this one on and away you go. I'll run through the, actually I'll go with the full C1, which has the compressor / expander, the gate as well, and this section here, which is another form of sidechain compression. This right here though, with this sidechain beast, it is actually built in within its own signal. You're actually not sidechaining, let's say, like the kick sending the signal. It's actually just taking essentially like a how do you call it? Like a deesser. It's taking a certain frequency range that will activate the compressor within its own signal. So let's say you have a full set of drums, and most everything is in from the low mids to like the highs, but the kick has a lot of low end. So what you could do is within this one signal of a full drum kit, you could select just the frequency range of the kick drum so that it side changes the rest of the drums, and it compresses the rest of the drums but not the kick. So that's kind of useful. But just the basic compressor, it's very transparent, and it has your very typical parameters here. You have makeup, threshold, ratio, which actually drops down from 1 to 1, and that's what is called an expander. So you have your 1 to 1, which is just your standard nothing happening. Anything from over 1 to 1 is compressing. Anything lower from 1 to 1 is expanding. So what that does is when a signal hits the threshold that you set it at, instead of turning it down, which is what a compressor does, an expander turns that signal up after a certain threshold, at the ratio that you set it. So yeah, there's that. This one also cranks to like some weird shit here, like minus all kinds. I've never actually seen that before, but this one does it, and I'm pretty sure there's some kind of use for it. But anywho, yeah, the attack, the release, same kind of stuff. And this PDR is some sort of program dependent release or something like that, where you can have your standard release, you set that to what you want, but then this is like a secondary release where if the transients and the signal is shorter than what is what you set this at, then it'll be different than the release you've already set it at. I don't know exactly how it affects it and how it's exactly what's going on. So if you want to look up something like that, there's a manual which will tell you exactly what is going on. Yeah, so that's it for the C1. Next up, the Cubase stock compressor, which is likewise, it's a digital one. It's very transparent. It has some other features. This one you can actually turn a soft knee on or have it on hard knee. And what that does is, see right here, this is the threshold and the ratio slope. So when the compressor activates, it's very when you have it on the hard knee, it's very much on or off. So it could be quite noticeable if you have it like a very high setting. It's very noticeable when it comes on and when it turns off. But when you have the soft knee, it sort of blends the range from where it's starting to turn on and when it's releasing. Like this whole little area gets sort of softened, and it makes for a little bit more kind of transparent but a little bit less noticeable compression. It just has more of a softer edge. This compressor also has an automatic makeup gain, which it'll automatically boost the volume by the amount that it's gain reducing. So that's quite handy if you're just trying to let's say shape your sound a little bit and you just kind of want to have levels nice and equal. Let's say on a vocal, it'll blend it nice RMS style. But if you're doing something like side chaining, you don't want this because that'll essentially cancel out the effect of the side chaining, which is reducing the volume. When you put the auto on, it'll boost the volume by how much it's reducing is. You don't want that when you're side chaining. Likewise, it has the attack and the release. It also has the automatic release, which is also quite handy. Rather than dialing in the release and have it on only one particular setting, if you have a bunch of different transients, different noises coming in, the auto will just adjust to all those different things and calculate how long the release should be automatically, which is nice. You also have the hold function, which is kind of cool for effects and stuff. It's not a very typical thing to have, but can be useful. It'll hold, once it's like fully activated, it'll hold it for that many milliseconds before it starts to release. So it can be quite handy if you're looking for that kind of thing. And the analysis, and on this one, as well as I think the Logic one, the Logic stock compressor has this as well, the peak and RMS, and some other compressors do this too. When the compressor is looking at the peaks, it will compress, it'll reduce gain more readily. It'll look at the peaks and decide to drop them down much more significantly, rather than when it's looking at the RMS, it's trying to bring the levels closer to each other, and more stable. So it'll look ahead and it'll calculate to reduce the volume a little bit less than at peak. I don't know exactly, same thing with this. I'm not 100% sure what the algorithms, all that kind of techno mumbo jumbo stuff is going on, but essentially, like, what I've noticed is when you have it at peak, it'll reduce gain, transients and stuff much more readily than when it's on RMS. So RMS is more like a nice blend. Peak is like hard gain reduction. So another compressor which is cool and very useful is Native Instruments VC2A, and it's modeled after a physical compressor that was like invented in the 1950s or something, like way back when, and has been kind of a staple for many years. There's also two more, the VC 160 and 76, which is the same kind of compression. It's like a classic compression. Essentially, this one here is two dials. You have your input gain, so how much you're just gonna ramp it up, and then just peak reduction. And this is very useful for, I found, especially for vocals. But things that typically like non-percussive things, so like guitars, basses, vocals, which are quite how do you say, like nice and flowy. They don't have hard peaks and stuff. You can use it with drums, and I have actually, but it works really, really well to just boost levels and to essentially limit. So I use it on vocals a lot. So you also have the compression or the limit function. The limit function, I think, is basically going to hard limit the peaks to a certain level, whereas compression will just have a certain ratio and won't hard limit. It'll just let some of the peaks rise further than if you would have had it on limit. But yeah, this one's very good for just leveling out whatever your signal is. And I think as well, it might have some of the analog characteristics. So like the circuitry noise, I think they have that built into this plugin. And that's what modeling after these old vintage analog compressors that's what the companies look for as well, is that actual analog noise and characteristic. So they'll model that after it. Another analog compressor, which is something a little bit less vintage, more, let's say 1980s kind of thing, where you have your typical parameters, where you have your threshold, your ratio, attack, release. And it also has a nice characteristic, like the color that comes from the analog machines. And I think this button right here, when you set it to off, it actually has no coloring effect. And the higher the number you go, like 1 up to 4, the higher the number, the more analog characteristic it will have. This one's nice too, because it has a you have like your standard milliseconds release, but you can also have the release set to the fixed BPM of the host application, which is cool. Or you could set it to a certain BPM. And that's nice, because then you don't have to calculate your milliseconds as to what it would be in beats per minute and whatnot. So very cool for like pumping effect. You just set it on your host or a BPM, and there you go. Another feature on this one is the punch dial, which I think it'll affect your transients mostly. So either it'll preserve some of those transients or accentuate the transients in some way to give it a little bit more punch. And it probably colors it a little bit too in some way, like some kind of saturation. And it also has a dry wet mix knob, which is essentially that parallel compression that I was talking about earlier, which I might go into more detail later. So you can mix the dry signal with the wet signal to get your desired sound. And the H comp is quite close to the V comp, which are both modeled after analog compressors. The V comp also has a limiter on it, and you can set your limit level with a fast or slow attack and your different release settings. Yeah, your input and output. Analog dial, same thing. So you'll have more color, etc. when you turn on the analog. And then your couple different ratio settings, and it actually has a deesser built into it, which is kind of useful as well. This works great for pretty much everything. Like, I've used it on snares, kicks, vocals, guitars, basses. I haven't really used it on synths, but I'm sure it would work pretty dope. It adds a nice amount of color and is at the same time somewhat transparent, so it's doing its job as a compressor, which is good. The next one in line, the Solid Bus Comp by Native Instruments, which is modeled after the SSL console. I can't remember if it's a G or E or whatever. There's like different kinds, but it's modeled after one of them. And this is the one that I had demonstrated before with all the very typical settings, as well as the dry wet signal. Yeah, I kind of explained that one already. So now we're into the multi-bands. So as of, or prior to now, these compressors were all single band. They're just taking the whole signal, compressing the whole signal as per your settings. These ones here, the last three, are actually multi-band compressors. So it splits the signal into multiple bands. These two are 4. These two compressors have 4 bands. And this last one has 5 bands. And I'll get to this one after I'm done explaining these two. So you have your different bands. It'll select, like it'll take the signal, the different bands. It'll take that certain band, whatever you set your frequencies to, and then it'll compress each individual band differently depending on your settings here. And Cubase's stock one has just very simple parameters: your threshold, your ratio, your attack, and your release, which you can put on auto or just set it in yourself. And you can bypass certain bands, or you can solo it, so when you're dialing it in, you hear only that band rather than everything that's going on. So that's quite handy. And then the output signal as well. And also volume. This is the gain. So like a certain band you can turn up or turn down as well. This one here is the Waves C4, which is just like the Cubase one. You have 4 bands. You select your frequency ranges, and then you also have your threshold for each separate band, your gain, attack and release for each separate band, and the bypass and the solo. So solo, you dial in or you can bypass it. Hear the difference with it on or off. And then instead of having a ratio, it has a range. So it's quite similar to having ratio, except it's a little bit more, I find a little bit easier to control exactly how you want your compressor to act. So rather than just trying to set a ratio to the levels that you want, you could just set a range where I only want the compressor to compress up to 4 dBs of compression, and after it hits that 4 dB mark, then it won't compress any further. And that's quite nice. It's not quite the same as having a ratio. And there's also the master control. So let's say you have your thresholds. They're all kind of in different places, right? And if you want to turn all of them down by the same amount, rather than going to each separate one, like minus 10, so that's minus 33, blah blah blah, and then go to the next one, you just go over here to the master control and set them all down at the same amount, and it keeps the relationship between them. And there's also on this the release. You could have it set on hard manual, so it'll be exactly what you set it at here, or you can have it on ARC, which is automatic release control or something. I don't know what the C stands for. And it'll automatically release the compression as per some algorithm, but also it'll take into account your release. So if you have, let's say, a really fast release, it'll release automatically, but it'll be closer to your settings So it'll be closer to a fast release, even though it thinks to release much longer. It'll sort of react to that. Or if you have a really high release and it thinks to release much quicker, it'll sort of take into account and release. It'll release earlier than the settings because it has already decided it, but it'll take into account your release settings and sort of find a happy medium, kind of. Now, this one also has the knee function, so you can go soft or hard, and that's a macro control for all of the bands. You can't dial in separately, but that's fine because that's all you really need anyways. And then it also has a release behavior, which is either opto or electro. And electro is when the release... it's kind of hard to explain. I'll put this on the drums, and I'll try and demonstrate. Okay, so you can see the release, or sorry, this yellow line is how much it's compressing, and when it releases, it's back up to the top here, and it releases quite quickly, kind of just jumping up and down, and that's on the electro setting. When you have it on opto settings, it takes a little bit longer for it to go from close to the top. I think it's about the 3 dB mark or something, or 1, I don't know, something like that. When it's closer to 0, it takes longer to hit the 0. So it'll release, and then it'll slow down before it hits 0, and then release slowly until it hits 0. And that's the opto setting. The electro setting, it'll release faster, closer to 0 than the opto. So it's just having, more options to dial in exactly how you want your compressor to react. So yeah, that covers those ones. And the last one here is the linear phase multiband, and it's by Waves also. It has 5 bands, and this one is very transparent, which is perfect for mastering if you want to keep that nice transparency of what the mix is already. You don't want to, shape the sound too differently. This one has the 5 bands. You have the threshold, the gain, the range again rather than the ratio, attack, release, solo, and bypass as well. On the other side here, there's the dither option. So you can have it off, or you can have it dither to lower bits. I think it'll go down to 16-bit. Some of them you can actually define whether it's 24 or 16. I think it goes down to 16 on this one. And that's good for the mastering, because you want to, at the very end of your chain, you want to dither down to whatever final product. So if you're going to CD quality, which is 16-bit, you would dither down to 16-bit. Also, it has automatic makeup gain or manual gain, so you can dial in the manually, or you can have auto. So when you bring the threshold down, it brings the gain up, and it'll adjust the gain as per what your settings are. What else? We got this adaptive function, which is close and actually sort of built into the same thing of the ARC. So you have your manual release, which will look exactly to what your settings are, or you can have it in automatic, which will automatically adjust to it. And I think that's what this adaptive number is. It's telling how much of that automatic release do you want mixed in. So when you're going 12, that's full on above 0 of the automatic release. So it's going to overpower your manual settings, and essentially all you'll hear is the adaptive settings. But when you dial it down, let's say it's off, it'll be completely what your release settings are. So you can mix it a little bit. So if your release is always quite long and the automatic release is trying to release it sooner, when you're mixing in the adaptive, it'll get louder and louder. The sooner release will get louder and louder. And when you have it lower and lower, the original release settings that you had already put will be louder. Something like that. It's kind of hard to explain, and you probably want to look into the manual if you really want to get into details on how exactly it works. And also it has a trim function, which is nice, and I'll show you that on the drums as well. It's also really nice for in the mastering process. So what it does is it sees how far above zero it's clipping or how much room you have to zero. Right now it's clipping, so it's clipping at 1.5 dB. So if you hit the trim, it lowered it by 1.5 dB. So now it's not going to clip. That's quite handy for the mastering. So you just have your levels built into the plugin. Yeah, I think that covers pretty much all what I wanted to go through. If you have any comments or questions, again, just leave them in the comment section. I'll address it as quickly as I can. And yeah, the ones that I chose are definitely plugins that I do use, and I find them to be quite high quality. The Cubase ones aren't as high quality as the Waves ones, and I don't think as high quality as the Native Instruments, but they do work quite well. Like, I've used this quite a bit. I find it's less transparent than the C4, and sometimes that's what I'm going for, so I'll choose this to really shape a sound. But yeah, no, these ones I've used quite extensively. So yeah, anyways, that pretty much wraps it all up, and hopefully that helps in whatever way, and I'll probably see you at another time. So bye.